A few weeks ago, I released a video on my channel where I talked about two old machines that I bought from the Indian marketplace OLX. To recap that video, I found a Pentium Pro machine on a local classified site, and on close inspection it was one of the most disgusting machines I've ever seen. But after some basic tinkering and cleaning, it did power on and I was able to access the BIOS. Now, while this video is being released just a few short weeks later, it's actually about 6 months now since I picked up the machines. The reason being that I just kept running into issues, which I'll explain more about as we go, but without further ado, allow me to explain what happened next. Now, when we left the PC, it was powering on, but we were missing parts like a hard disk, and I couldn't really do much with it. It also seemed a little unhappy, erroneously reporting that the 150MHz Pentium Pro was running at 120MHz. I managed to track down the manual for the motherboard and double check the jumpers were set correctly for a 150MHz CPU, and they were. Next, I stripped off all the jumpers and cleaned the pins before replacing them, just in case there was a build-up of corrosion or grime. This didn't yield any positive results, but interestingly, if I misset the jumpers for a different speed CPU, the system wouldn't post at all. So the settings I was using were at least valid. Next, I decided to get a better look at the CPU itself, and I did find quite a bit of corrosion to the top of the processor and some gunk on the pins. I cleaned this off and gave the socket itself a good clean, just in case there was any debris inside, and while it all still worked when I reassembled it, there was no change in the reported speed. At this point, I was a little lost for inspiration, and as the machine did at least work, I decided to just crack on with the rest of the build and maybe revisit this issue later. The first thing I decided to swap out was the power supply. I opened up the original 235 watt unit and found this scorch mark inside, and although my PSU testers seemed to show it was working okay, I didn't want to risk it, so I ordered this replacement second-hand unit instead. This one seems to be putting out voltages nearer to what it should, and it's also a higher powered unit at 350 watts, so I shouldn't run into any power issues if I add anything down the line. To be honest, the old PSU worked just fine, but given its unknown history and its potential for taking out the rest of the system, this just seemed like a good idea. Speaking of power, I also swapped out the CMOS battery on the motherboard, which thankfully hadn't leaked. I was lucky that this was just a standard CR2032 coin cell and not an earlier lithium battery that appeared on some boards. A pack of these just cost me a few pounds, and now all the BIOS settings are retained when it's disconnected from the mains. Next, I had to sort out a hard disk, as this was missing when I picked up the machine. Now, originally I had a plan to install this IDE hard disk caddy in the 5¼ inch bay so that I could swap out the hard disks easily for trying out different operating systems in the future. But unfortunately, I discovered while playing around with the machine that the built-in IDE channels on the motherboard just don't work. I've checked the manual to make sure I've got the BIOS set right, and I've even upgraded the BIOS to the latest available version that I could find online, but I just can't get the built-in IDE controller to recognise any drives I connect on either channel. For that reason, I bought this new old stock Promise IDE controller card, which did allow me to install an IDE drive and have it be bootable, and I actually managed to install MS-DOS on it. But I ran into issues when using a CD-ROM drive with this card while in DOS, so it was back to square one and using the original Adaptec SCSI controller and SCSI devices. This isn't ideal as replacement parts are harder to come by and much more expensive, but I suppose it does keep the machine true to its roots. I could have used standard hard disks on the IDE controller and a CD-ROM drive on the SCSI controller, but then the whole thing begins to get rather complicated and I've wasted a valuable PCI slot that I might want to use later. So, I managed to pick up this 2GB IBM SCSI drive from 1996, which matches the age of this system quite well and should give me decent performance. I am slightly concerned about the noise it's going to generate, but I can always look at swapping this out for an SD card adapter device in the future, which would also satisfy my need to be able to swap out drives easily for different OSs. Moving on to the optical drive, and after a cleanup, the original SCSI CD-ROM drive was completely dead. But after a bit of fault finding, I worked out that it was just the switch for opening and closing the drive that had failed, And it's luckily a standard push-to-make switch, so I just pulled one from a faulty drive, and it then opened and closed. Sort of. After a strip down, clean and lube, it opens a bit better, though clearly it's still having a bit of trouble. If the draw mechanism does eventually fail, then I've managed to track down this new old stock unit from Cyberdrive. That's not a name I've heard of, but being that it's a new drive, it stands a better chance of working should I need it to, and it's also a 24 speed versus quad speed for the original drive, so would give better performance. But I do really like this flip down door mechanism on this old drive, and it just feels right to use original parts wherever possible. Lastly, on the SCSI side, I'm going to include the Tandberg tape drive just to see if it works. I took it apart and gave it a good clean and lube, and mechanically it seems sound, so it'll be interesting to see if it works properly in the future. I even managed to track down this 3M tape, which should be compatible with the drive and gives me a whopping 525 megabytes of backup space. In terms of floppy drives, I've cleaned up the TAC 5¼ unit and it's come up okay. I'm going to throw it in and see if it's recognised. I do have a couple of known working 5¼ floppies that I can try with it to see if it works. To be honest, the machine doesn't really suit this drive, but it came with it originally, so it's going back in. And also, I don't have a blanking plate that will fill the hole if I take it out. I've also sourced a replacement 3.5-inch floppy drive for the machine. The old one decided to break the first time I used it, so I picked up this brand new unit and hopefully it'll work well enough for me to be able to load some drivers and some older DOS games onto this machine. In terms of expansion cards, we've got the Adaptec SCSI controller, which has tidied up nicely even though the ends of the 50-pin connector have snapped off. I did have to replace the original cable though, mostly because it was nasty, but also because the plastic had gone very brittle and the connectors were coming apart while I was testing. This brand new unit is in a much better condition and should work just fine. I was kind of surprised I was able to find one of these so readily when SCSI hasn't used this form factor in about 25 years. It does kind of warm my heart slightly to know there's stuff like this just sat on shelves in warehouses in 2020. I also cleaned up the Trident VGA card and got rid of all the rust from the rear bracket. This was simple enough with a dish scouring pad and some isopropyl alcohol. I know this will never give me a perfect finish, but it's definitely a lot better than it was before. I decided not to reinstall the Ethernet card that had come with the machine. It was a later edition anyway, and I don't really have any plans to connect the machine to my network, so it seemed a little bit of a waste of a PCI slot. Lastly, I decided to add a sound card to this machine, and honestly that's where most of the problems have stemmed from. I actually already had a few ISA sound cards that I'd picked up in a job lot a while back, but they weren't PMP cards, which meant I had to set them up manually either via jumpers or a software config tool. Unfortunately, I just couldn't get any of these cards to actually work with this system. Now, I don't know the history of these cards, so I don't even know if they still work. I tried these Aztec cards first, but the DOS-based configuration tool just crashed whenever I tried to run it. I decided to use the Creative card instead as this was configured via jumpers, but this wasn't recognised either. Given that these cards appeared dead, I had to jump on eBay and see if I could find any other options, and off the back of that I picked up this OR64 ISA card and this Creative Live PCI card. The plan was to use the OR64, but the PC card was my contingency as I was beginning to suspect that the ISA slots just weren't working on this board. After a lot of fault finding, I came to the conclusion that there does seem to be something wrong with these ISA slots. I found some really helpful guides for setting up the known working OR64 from Phil's Computer Lab, which led me to install this plug-and-play utility for DOS, and the cards just don't show up, even the ones that are supposed to be plug-and-play. After a lot of research and head-scratching, my leading theory is that the same issue that's causing the processor speed to be misrepresented and the IDE channels not to work is also causing some issues with these ISA slots. I don't have a huge amount of experience in this area, but from my limited knowledge I'd say either one of the integrated controller chips has failed, or there's a problem with power delivery most likely caused by dodgy capacitors. This isn't something I can afford to devote time to at the moment, but if you're a fan of my channel you'll know that I'm no stranger to a soldering iron, so this might be something I look into in the future. So with the ISA slots not usable, I'm resigned to using the PCI card for sound, which doesn't really match with the rest of the machine, but with a bit of tweaking it should give me reasonable sound options in Windows and DOS. With all of that said, I now have everything I need in one place to put this machine back together. But before I do that, I wanted to take a good hard look at the case itself. The first step was to look at the steel chassis, which, as you can see, was pretty tarnished and rusty in places. I could have sanded it back and painted it, but I decided to just clean it up the best I could, as it's going to be stored in a climate-controlled environment from now on, so I'm not too concerned about the rust progressing. I tried using isopropyl alcohol for this, but it didn't really make a dent, so I switched to this motorcycle spray cleaner that I had lying around, and it made really light work of the grime. It's by no means perfect, but it's definitely a lot cleaner, and even some of the surface rust has come away. I also added some felt pads to the base in place of the missing rubber feet. These should help isolate noise somewhat, and will also make it easier to move the PC around the desk without scratching it. The original expansion slot covers were pretty far gone. It looks like they weren't coated anyway, so they rusted a lot more than the rest of the chassis. Rather than try and clean them up, I just replaced them with some spares I had lying around. Some of the screws were also quite tarnished, but I left these in a bowl of white vinegar to remove some of the rust. It didn't work amazingly, but at least some of the corrosion has been worked loose. The rear I/O shield was also a little rusty, so I carefully pried this loose and left it in the vinegar as well, and it seemed a little bit better as a result. With that done, I also cleaned the outside of the case, but I'm not going to reveal just how that went just yet. However, this photo of the front panel in my bath after being sprayed with the motorcycle cleaner probably tells you more than you need to know. I then gave the rest of the internal components a proper clean with some isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush to remove the last of the grime and dust for them, before carefully reassembling the whole machine, including the new parts. So, with all that done, I hope you're as excited as I am to see the full setup in all its glory. Here it is. What a transformation this is. You would think that you're looking at a machine fresh off the production line in 1995. Okay, maybe not, but it's definitely in a better state than when I found it. The case has come up really well, and other than some chips and scratches to the metalwork, it's looking really good. The most remarkable transformation has been this front panel. After it got a deep clean in the bath, it looked a lot better, but removing the original case badges showed just how much yellowing had occurred. I decided I wanted to return it to its former glory, so I soaked it outside in some hydrogen peroxide solution for a few hours on a hot day. This removed pretty much all of the discoloration. It's come up pretty well, even if it's not back to its original factory finish. You could still just about make out where the original badges were, but it's certainly a lot better. I also realised that one of the plastic clips that held on the front panel was broken. So to keep it in place, I've attached some sticky back Velcro to the bottom of it and another piece to the chassis itself. That way it's held firmly in place, but I can still easily remove it if I need to. I've also added some replacement Windows 95 and Pentium Pro badges, courtesy of Geekenspiel. You can check out his eBay store and Instagram in the description below, he does some really great stuff. I've also added a domed badge featuring my channel logo that sits atop of the original HCL logo. Now, the eagle-eyed will appreciate that this isn't the original monitor. Unfortunately, that looks like it was just well beyond repair. Not only was the connector completely oxidized, but inside there was a lot of water damage and it was just completely dead. This LG unit is a later model than the rest of the system, but it works well with the aesthetic and it'll do for now. To drive this beast, I've managed to pick up a couple of period correct HP input devices. It would have been nice to find real HCL branded accessories, but given that they were affiliated with Hewlett-Packard, this seems like a reasonable compromise to make. This mid-90s membrane keyboard needed a deep clean, and the whole thing got a peroxide bath along with the front fascia to bring back its former glory. It's actually got a really nice action on it, and it should suit me well while gaming and typing on this machine. Paired with the keyboard is this period-correct HP ball mouse, which just needed a strip down and clean. Nothing special with this mouse, just 2 buttons and a scroll wheel. To provide output for that sound card, I picked up these creative speakers which fit nicely with the aesthetic of the system and kick out surprisingly good sound to boot. These could probably do with a peroxide bath as well, but for now I think they blend quite nicely. Lastly, I've got this QuickShot Warrior joystick which was brand new in box and is the exact model I had on my dad's Packard Bell 486 back in 1994. It's not that well regarded to be honest, but it's a bit of a nostalgia kick for me and it should be adequate for some of the DOS and Windows 95 games that I want to play. To complete my retro workstation, I've got these typically beige floppy disk and CD storage systems which houses all of the software that isn't in a big box. I actually ordered these from 2 different sellers on eBay and I didn't realise they were from the same product line until they both arrived. The smaller one could definitely do with a peroxide bath, but for now I'll have to live with the disparity between the two. So, without further delay, let's fire this bad boy up. Yeah, it's a tad loud. SCSI drives were renowned for their performance and reliability, but certainly not for their quietness. During the repair stage, this SCSI drive was certainly a lot louder than the various IDE drives I tried to use, particularly when I had the case off. The front case fan isn't particularly quiet either, but given that Pentium Pro features no active cooling, I think it's best we keep it on and get a little airflow through this case. In terms of software, we're running Windows 95 OSR 2.5, which was the last public release of Windows 95, and included USB support and Internet Explorer 4.0. So, what kind of titles can we expect this thing to run? Certainly anything requiring a 3D accelerator will be a big no-no, and obviously older titles designed for DOS will be no problem. But just what can that Pentium Pro CPU handle? Well, let's find out.
Okay, we'll spread out commando style. Laverne, you go secure the area behind those double doors. Hoagie, you take care of upstairs reconnaissance. I'll maintain Command HQ here, in the lobby.
First one with 100% damage is the loser, so we can finally see who's better with a flight stick. What do you say?
You're on, pal.
Let's see if you still got it, Farmer Blair.
Incoming Ovon fighters.
So, as you can see, it's a little bit of a mixed bunch. Most older games are no problem at all, though some actually find the 120 MHz clock speed a little too high to handle. Theme Park in particular was pretty much uncontrollable. Most other games I tried worked fine, other than a few issues with sound in some titles, like these hanging notes in Day of the Tentacle. It was starting to struggle with some later titles, like Populous the Beginning, but this is hardly surprising, and I think it might even struggle if it were working at the advertised speed. So what can I say really? I'm incredibly happy with the way this build came together. It's pretty surprising that it worked at all really, but to be able to clean it up and get it working this well is a pretty awesome feat, even if I do say so myself. Some people may sneer over the failed IDE controller and ISA slots, or the CPU frequency being wrong, but in my mind these don't take much away from this machine. Put it this way, there are plenty of videos out there on YouTube with inspiring footage of dogs with missing limbs, and they don't care. They run around chasing balls all day and don't even consider that they're any different. This machine is the electronic equivalent of those dogs. It's got bits that don't work, it's maybe a little slower than it otherwise would be, but it doesn't care. It just wants to play Destruction Derby and Theme Park. I've gone back and forth in my mind since finishing this refurbishment as to whether I try and fix these issues or just roll with them. And seeing as this machine does everything I wanted it to do, I think I'm just going to leave it be. What I would like to do is use this machine as a basis for trying out many of the things I never got a chance to back in the 90s. For instance, I've got this sealed copy of IBM OS2 which I've been meaning to crack open and try out, and it should fly on this machine. I also want to see if I can get that Tandberg tape drive working, and if not, I wonder just what else I could shove in its place and connect to that SCSI controller. If these sound like things that might interest you, then feel free to hit that subscribe button, and if you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and let me know in the comments what you think, or maybe what else you'd like to see me do with this machine. Other than that, nothing remains but to thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you again real soon. Bye bye.